The most painful betrayals don't come from people you barely knew. They come from the ones you prayed about before you trusted them. And that's the part nobody talks about, because it's the part that doesn't just hurt, it confuses. If you brought it to God, if you took your time, if you did everything right, how did you still end up here? So quietly, underneath the anger at them, there's something directed inward. You started wondering if your judgment is broken, if something in you is wired to miss the signs, if you are, somehow, the common denominator in your own pain. Let God interrupt that thought right now. Because there is a difference, a significant, important difference, between your trust being genuine and them being trustworthy. One speaks to your character. The other speaks to theirs. And God never confused the two, and even when you started to. God didn't look at you opening that door and see foolishness. He saw someone built for love, doing exactly what love requires: the risk, the vulnerability, the decision to believe in someone before they gave you every reason to. God does that too, every single day, with people who don't deserve it. You weren't wrong to trust. They were wrong to break it. And God saw exactly which one of those was the failure before you ever had to find out. The cruelest part of being betrayed by someone you trusted isn't what they did. It's what you've been saying to yourself ever since. You should have known. The signs were there. You saw things that didn't add up, and you chose to believe the explanation instead of your instinct. And now, in the quiet aftermath, that choice feels less like an act of faith and more like evidence. Evidence that your judgment can't be trusted, that your discernment failed you, that you let this happen. But here's what God saw. The self-blame is blocking you from seeing. There's a fundamental difference between a broken trust and an untrustworthy person. One is something that happened to you. The other is something they chose. And those two things are not the same. No matter how many times the voice in your head tries to collapse them into one verdict about who you are, God never designed you for a life of preemptive suspicion. He didn't wire you for walls. He called you toward love. And love, by its very nature, cannot be fully protected in advance. It requires extension. It requires offering something before you have proof that it will be handled carefully. God knows that risk better than anyone. He extended trust to humanity before humanity had done anything to earn it. He loved people who were already walking away from him. He gave himself to a world that would mishandle the gift, and he did it anyway. Not because he didn't see what was coming, but because love that only flows where it's guaranteed isn't the kind of love God is. When God watched you open your heart to that person, he didn't wince at your naivety. He recognized something of himself in you, the capacity to trust someone before they've proven themselves, the willingness to believe in a person's potential, even when the evidence was incomplete, the kind of love that extends before it has guarantees. That is not a flaw God wants to remove from you. There's a verse in Proverbs that's used to argue for higher walls and greater distance. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. But God never said, close your heart. He said, guard it, the way you guard something irreplaceable, something worth protecting, not something worth burying. Your capacity to trust is not the wound. It is the thing worth keeping. What they did revealed their character. It was never a verdict on yours. And God, who saw every moment of that relationship from the inside out, never once confused the two. What if the most important thing God was watching in that relationship wasn't them? It was you? Because here's what betrayal does that nothing else does quite the same way. It doesn't just expose the other person. It exposes everything that was quietly happening inside you while you were busy trusting them. And most of that exposure is uncomfortable. Not because you did something wrong, but because you were changed by that relationship in ways you didn't notice while you were inside it. You bent in directions you wouldn't have bent otherwise. You overlooked things that, in a different season, you would have addressed directly. You adjusted your needs downward, quietly, gradually, because keeping the peace felt more important than naming what was actually true. You built routines, emotional patterns, in entire ways of processing the world around the assumption that this person was solid ground. And God saw all of it, not with disappointment, not from a distance. He was watching the interior of that relationship, not the version you presented to others, not the highlights, not the narrative you constructed to make sense of it, but what was actually happening to your sense of self while you were in it. He saw where you started placing your security, the way their approval became something you quietly organized your behavior around, the way their consistency or inconsistency began to determine what kind of day you were having, the way your own voice got a little quieter the longer the relationship went on. God saw the slow reshaping, and He saw what you needed, not what you thought you needed, but what was actually required for the person He made you to be to survive intact. There's a prayer in Psalm 139 that most people read as a request. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Psalm 139:23. But after a betrayal, it reads differently. Less like an invitation and more like an acknowledgement that God was already doing this, already searching and already knowing the anxious thoughts you hadn't fully admitted to yourself yet. God didn't need the betrayal to know what was happening inside you, but you might have needed it to be still enough for Him to show you finally. He wasn't watching that relationship from the outside, waiting to see how it turned out. He was present in every moment of it, watching what it was building in you, watching what it was quietly costing you, watching what would only become visible once the structure around it came down. And what became visible, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's something God has been waiting to work with all along. What if God wasn't absent when the betrayal happened? What if that was precisely the moment He stepped in? Because most people ask the wrong question after being betrayed by someone they trusted. The question they ask is, why didn't God stop me from trusting them? But that question keeps you looking backward, at the wound, at what was lost, at what God seemingly failed to prevent. And it never reaches the more important thing God was actually doing. The question that changes everything is this: what version of you was God protecting when He allowed the structure to fall? Because here's what an untrustworthy person does that goes far beyond the initial betrayal. They reshape you, slowly, quietly, in ways you don't notice until you're already different. The longer you orient your life around someone who isn't trustworthy, the more their voice begins to occupy space that was never meant for them. Their approval starts to determine your sense of worth. Their version of who you are starts to feel more real than your own. Their inconsistency becomes the weather system your entire emotional life is organized around. And God, who was watching all of it, saw the displacement happening in real time. He saw his voice getting quieter in you as theirs got louder. He saw the version of you being constructed within that dynamic. And he knew that version wasn't the one he made. He saw the foundation forming under your feet and recognized it for what it was, something that looked stable but was never going to hold. There's a passage in Isaiah that usually gets quoted to mean, "Oh, God is mysterious and unknowable. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways." Isaiah 55, 8-9. But that's not what it means here. Higher doesn't mean distant. It means God had a view of this situation that you, from inside the pain, simply couldn't access. He could see the whole landscape from one corner. He could see where the road you were on was leading, not just for that relationship, but for your sense of self, your identity, your ability to hear him clearly, if it continued long enough to become permanent. And in a mercy that felt nothing like mercy at the time, God let the wrong structure collapse before it became the foundation on which you built everything else. God didn't protect you from the betrayal. He protected you through it. From a version of yourself that was slowly being constructed around the wrong thing. He saw that the foundation had cracked long before, and what he was protecting, that's exactly where we're going next. The question that sits heaviest after betrayal isn't about them. It's about you, and whether you'll ever be able to open that door again. And the honest answer is, you're not sure. Not yet. Because the last time you were sure, it cost you something you're still calculating the full price of. So the idea of trusting again doesn't feel like hope. It feels like standing at the edge of something you already fell off once, being asked to step forward anyway. But here's what God is not asking you to do. He's not asking you to trust as you did before, with the same unexamined openness, with the same habit of placing your entire sense of stability on whether another person shows up consistently, with the same invisible architecture where someone else's choices become the ground beneath your feet. That version of trust wasn't wrong because it was too much. It was mislocated. The weight was real. It just needed a different place to land. Because here's what changes after God becomes the foundation instead of the person. Every relationship that comes after carries less weight. Not because it matters less, but because it no longer has to hold everything. The new person in your life doesn't walk in carrying the debt of everyone who failed you before them. They don't have to prove themselves against a standard built from your worst experiences. They get to just be a person, imperfect and human, without being asked to be your ground. God designed relationships to be built on top of a foundation, not to be the foundation itself. And until the wrong foundation collapsed, you couldn't fully feel the difference. There's an image in Jeremiah that reframes what this season has actually been building. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. Jeremiah 17, 7-8. A tree planted by the water doesn't stop growing because a storm came through. It survives the storm because its roots went somewhere the storm couldn't reach. God was never trying to make you smaller after this betrayal. He was trying to make you deeper. The storm that came through, the collapsed trust, the broken foundation, the disorientation of discovering someone wasn't who you believed them to be. God was using all of it to drive your roots somewhere more permanent than a person's consistency. Not into bitterness, not into self-protection, and not into a life where you keep everyone at a careful, managed distance. Into Him. Into a security that exists completely independent of what any person decides to do next. And from that place, that rooted, grounded, storm-tested place, you will trust again. Not less. Not more carefully in a way that's really just fear with better vocabulary. Differently, with roots that go somewhere no person can reach and no betrayal can sever. God spent this entire season making sure of that. And the person you're becoming on the other side of it, that's who He saw all along. What they did was wrong. That doesn't get rewritten. That doesn't get spiritually explained away into something acceptable. The betrayal was real, the cost was real, and God never asked you to pretend otherwise. But here is what is equally true, and what this entire conversation has been building toward. God was not watching from a distance while it happened. He was inside every moment of it, working in directions you couldn't see from where you were standing. He was in confusion with no clear resolution. He was in the silence that felt like absence, but wasn't. He was in the slow, unglamorous process of something being rebuilt in you that the betrayal itself made necessary. A foundation that is finally located somewhere no person can shake. You didn't come through this smaller. You came through it more anchored than ever, and the trust you carry forward isn't the fragile kind that collapses when people prove themselves human. It's the kind that has been tested, and now knows exactly what it's standing on. God saw what you couldn't, not as a passive observation, but as an active, intentional, never once distracted act of love. If that landed somewhere real today, stay a little longer. Subscribe to this channel, because this is the space where the hard questions get asked honestly every single week. Share this with someone still in the middle of the wound. Like this video if it gave language to something you've been carrying without words. And leave one line in the comments, just, God saw what I couldn't. Not as proof that you're healed, but as the first honest thing you've let yourself believe today. You were never as alone in it as it felt, and God has never once looked away.